Welcome to Lecture 1, Principles of Macroeconomics. My name is Professor Nils Keynes. I'm from the University of Melbourne, where I'm the Deputy Dean of the Faculty of Business and Economics. I'm also a Professor of Macroeconomics. In our first lecture, what I'm going to do is describe for you the discipline of macroeconomics, explain a little bit about economics itself and how macroeconomics fits into the broader discipline of economics, talk a little bit about the methodology of macroeconomics, and then describe for you some of the main themes that macroeconomists look at, which will also be the main themes that we will cover in our course. So macroeconomics is the study of the aggregate economy. It deals with big economic issues involving national output, the rates of inflation and unemployment, monetary and fiscal policies, international trade, exchange rates, the business cycle, economic growth, and so on. These are issues of first-order importance, issues that dominate the news and politics, issues that decide the fate of governments, issues that have very real effects on the economic welfare of virtually every person on the planet every single moment of the day. The importance of macroeconomics cannot be overstated. Understanding the world of the 21st century and the forces that are shaping that world requires an understanding of macroeconomics. Now, macroeconomics is a comparatively young discipline. In its modern guise, it dates back to 1936 and the publication of John Maynard Keynes' famous book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money. That book, published during the greatest economic cataclysm of the 20th century, the Great Depression, revolutionized thinking about the aggregate economy. It demonstrated that a different set of tools to those usually employed by economists was needed to understand events like the Great Depression, and also to recommend to government policies that might avoid future catastrophic breakdowns in the workings of the macroeconomy. Since then, of course, both the world and macroeconomics have steadily evolved. We now face macroeconomic problems that were simply not relevant at the time of Keynes. We have, for example, passed through the 20 years of the Great Inflation, the name given to the decades of the 1970s and 1980s, where once again reality served up a set of circumstances, this time a sustained period of what's called double-digit inflation, that required refinement of the economist's toolkit. And today, topics such as globalization and the rise of new economic powers like China and India, the IT revolution, and of course the global financial crisis continue to pose challenges for macroeconomists and policymakers alike. This course provides an introduction to modern macroeconomics for those beginning their study of economics. It does not attempt to provide an encyclopedic treatment of the discipline. Instead, my approach will be to emphasize some of the key ideas that have shaped modern thinking about macroeconomics, and to present those ideas in as intuitive way as is possible. Throughout the course, I will encourage you to think like an economist by providing examples from recent economic history to show how macroeconomics can aid in the understanding of important real-world events. Too often, in my view, macroeconomics is presented as a series of disputes between scholars. And certainly disputes among macroeconomists occur, and the arguments and subsequent debate are an important means by which the discipline moves forward. But it is also wrong to suggest that there is not a great deal of common ground amongst macroeconomists. In essence, ideas about the workings of the economy that have proven their usefulness over the years. And it is these ideas that form the core of this course. As generations of macroeconomics students will attest, ours is a complex and challenging discipline. It requires proficiency in an extraordinary wide range of skills. Keynes himself, somewhat archaically now, once said, "The master economist must possess a rare combination of gifts. He must reach a high standard in several different directions and must combine talents not often found together. He must be a mathematician, historian, statesman, philosopher in some degree. He must understand symbols and speak in words. He must contemplate the particular in terms of the general and touch abstract and concrete in the same flight of thought. He must study the present in the light of the past for the purposes of the future. No part of man's nature or his institutions must lie entirely outside his regard. He must be purposeful and disinterested in a simultaneous mood, as aloof and incorruptible as an artist, yet sometimes as near the earth as a politician. A few of us can live up to these high standards, yet the subject matter of macroeconomics is of such importance, dealing as it does with fundamental questions of what determines people's living standards and what governments can do to raise those standards, that we are obliged to try. In this course, you will begin your study of the present in light of the past for the purposes of the future. I wish you every success. Let's begin with a look at economics in general and how macroeconomics fits into the overall discipline. At the fundamental level, economics is almost always concerned with some aspect of decision-making. The tools of economics enable systematic analysis of how decisions are made and provide criteria for evaluating the success or otherwise of decisions. Decisions are an important part of how society operates. For economists, this is self-evident because of an astute observation made very early in the history of economics, namely that we live in a world of unlimited wants and needs, but where the resources necessary to meet those wants and needs are finite, or to use the term preferred by economists, scarce. And it is this scarcity of resources that means decision-making, in particular decisions about how those scarce resources will be allocated across competing needs, is of first-order importance to the functioning of any society, or indeed any part of that society. Think of your own decision-making. Each day you are called upon to make countless decisions. These might range from decisions about what groceries to buy at the local store, how you might spend your time today, should you apply for that new job, when and where will you take your vacation this year, and so on. Each and every one of the decisions you make reflects the scarcity of the resources that are available to you. For example, your income, or even the amount of time that you have available. You will need to make informed choices, weighing up the pros and cons of each and every decision you make. And you will need to make the decisions that best meet your needs, or perhaps those of your family, community, or your workplace. Economists regard this process of decision-making as being fundamental to how societies, and the individuals making up those societies, operate. And so decision-making is central to almost all analysis in economics. Economists study decision-making across all aspects of society. Sometimes economists are concerned with decision-making at the level of the individual, or perhaps the individual firm or business. Sometimes the focus of analysis is the operation of individual markets and how decisions made by many individuals and firms are coordinated in those markets. Macroeconomics, as we will see, looks at decision-making at an even higher level of aggregation, namely national economies and even the global economy. In particular, how do all these decisions taken by individuals, firms and governments influence national economies and the global economy? Do the decisions that are taken produce the best outcomes? Is there a role for government to influence decision-making and secure improved outcomes at the macroeconomic level? These are the broad questions that macroeconomists consider. Throughout recorded history, different societies have used different means to make decisions about how to allocate their scarce resources. Command economies, such as the former Soviet Union, for example, relied on decisions made by central planning agencies as to the uses that scarce resources will be put. Market economies, in contrast, adopt a decentralised approach, an approach in which the price system guides individual decision-making. For example, suppose the demand for a particular commodity outstrips its supply. We would expect its price, relative to that of other commodities, will then increase. In response, producers, attracted by the higher price, will shift resources towards that commodity. Consumers, discouraged by the higher price, will shift their purchasing power towards other commodities. The result, eventually, is the elimination of the gap between demand and supply, a situation that economists call equilibrium. Once in equilibrium, unless there is a fundamental change to market conditions that would cause the price to again change and producers and consumers to revise their decisions, the market will be at rest. The rise in price has guided consumers and producers' decisions to secure a coordination of their respective decision-making. What consumers wish to purchase exactly matches what firms are prepared to produce. What is sometimes called the magic of markets achieves this coordination. Prices provide powerful signals that secure market outcomes that ensure a smooth process of coordinated decision-making, a highly efficient way of dealing with the reality of scarce resources. Economics is traditionally divided into two main subdisciplines, microeconomics and macroeconomics. To some extent, the division is arbitrary, and there are clearly defined links between the two, particularly from microeconomics into macroeconomics. And sometimes certain topics are difficult to assign to one discipline as opposed to the other. Nevertheless, most economists view themselves as working primarily in one of these two disciplines. Microeconomic analysis emphasises individual units in the economy and how they interact through the medium of the market. It is a powerful mode of analysis that provides insight into the motivations and decision-making of individual consumers and producers, the circumstances in which markets successfully coordinate their actions, and mind you, this doesn't always work, a theme we will come back to, and the role government can play in addressing instances of market failure. Here are some examples of what might be regarded as typical microeconomics questions. But I stress the field is much broader than this, encompassing virtually all aspects of individual decision-making and the complex interactions that exist between individuals and the economic institutions such as the market that have evolved through time. With a limited budget, how should members of an individual household organise spending across goods and services? Given market conditions, how does a firm choose how much to produce? Will prices coordinate household spending and firms' production in a way that best allocates society's scarce resources? Macroeconomics, in contrast, and as the name suggests, shifts the emphasis away from the individual towards the aggregate. The name itself is derived from the Greek word macros, meaning large. As a generalization, one can think of macroeconomics as dealing with economic outcomes at the level of national economies and the global economy. However, the distinction between microeconomics and macroeconomics is not quite as stark as I have portrayed it. Many of the important analytical breakthroughs in macroeconomics, particularly in recent times, have come about by considering how the decision-making of individual units in the economy aggregates up to affect economic outcomes at the larger scale. An important part of modern macroeconomics is to consider what's known as its microeconomic foundations. And whilst this course will be devoted to macroeconomics, you will, by necessity, learn some microeconomics along the way. Here are some examples of questions studied by macroeconomists. Indeed, it is precisely these questions that we are going to answer in this course. What factors determine how much output a nation produces? Why do recessions occur? Why do different economies have different rates of inflation? What roles do monetary and fiscal policy play in managing the economy? And what are the sources of a nation's long-run growth? Let me return briefly to the market mechanism and to two of the most important concepts in economics, what are known as the fundamental theorems of welfare economics. The reason for having a look at this is to place the study of macroeconomics into some context. For many of the main problems studied by macroeconomists occur because of a breakdown in these fundamental theorems as they apply to the real world. The first fundamental theorem states that under ideal conditions, decentralized decision-making conducted through the medium of the market will lead to what is known as an optimal, that is, the best possible, allocation of resources. Economists are very precise when talking about optimal outcomes. What is meant by optimal is a situation in which there exists no possible way of reallocating resources that would make any one individual better off without harming at least one other individual. One can think of this as the no free lunch principle. When optimality has been achieved, one can't improve the welfare of any single person without harming at least one other person. However, if optimality has not been achieved, then unambiguous improvements in welfare can be achieved. People can be made better off through a reallocation of resources without harming anyone. The first fundamental theorem, which has a most elegant mathematical proof, states that decentralized decision-making in response to price signals and under certain ideal conditions yields an optimal outcome. This outcome is often known as Pareto optimality. The name is based on the great Italian economist Wilfredo Pareto, who died in 1923. And he was the first scholar to consider optimality in these terms. You'll often hear the term Pareto optimality in all branches of economics. The second fundamental theorem is slightly more technical and states that there will always be a market-determined outcome that will support any Pareto-efficient allocation. The fundamental welfare theorems are an important intellectual foundation for economists' general view that market-determined resource allocation can produce highly desirable outcomes. And in a variety of situations, we can see this to be true, but not in all situations. And whilst microeconomics, for example, do indeed spend a great deal of their time analysing cases where the fundamental theorems do not hold, in macroeconomics, the breakdown of the theorems is particularly important. We can see this in the work of Keynes, who was writing at the time of the Great Depression. Whilst cataclysmic events like the Great Depression and the more recent global financial crisis are extraordinarily complex and most certainly not amenable to simple explanations based on one or two key factors, for many macroeconomists, these represent radical departures from the world of the fundamental welfare theorems. A great deal of macroeconomics is concerned with instances where market-based economies do not allocate resources efficiently at the aggregate level. An important qualification before we go any further. Macroeconomics is by no means a settled discipline where there is complete consensus amongst scholars. Many of my colleagues would take issue with my view of macroeconomics, that it deals with instances of pronounced market failure. In fact, a great deal of extremely useful and powerful macroeconomic analysis can be undertaken viewing aggregate outcomes as optimal market-based responses to the external environment. Even what we call recessions may represent, in some sense, optimal market-based adjustments in response to events like a hike in oil prices or increased uncertainty about the future. These approaches to macroeconomics, sometimes labelled new classical macroeconomics or real business cycle theory, have provided much insight into the dynamic behaviour of modern economies. But these models are quite complex, and whilst worthy of study, will not be pursued in this course. Here the emphasis will be on the macroeconomic tradition that has its beginnings in the work of Keynes, which sees many macroeconomic outcomes as being instances of market failure, where there is scope for carefully designed macroeconomic policies to achieve better outcomes. As we have seen during the global financial crisis, this view of the macroeconomy is one widely held by governments across the world. Understanding government responses to the global financial crisis is achieved to a large extent by understanding this Keynesian tradition. This slide reproduces one of the most famous quotes from Keynes' great work, The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money. Keynes' argument was based around the hypothesis that optimal resource allocation, achieved through decision-making in response to market-based price signals, was a special case of a more general way of thinking about the economy. In this general model of the economy, equilibrium at the macroeconomic level can be consistent with a situation in which there is unemployed labour and businesses are working at less than full capacity. Whilst an equilibrium, that is, the economy is at rest, this cannot be optimal in the Pareto sense. For example, providing work for an unemployed person need not harm anyone else. This is the essence of the Keynesian approach to government management of the macroeconomy. Namely, there is a role for government to secure improved macroeconomic outcomes. This view forms the basis for government's response to the global financial crisis. The key is careful management of the economy, recognising there are limits to what governments can achieve, and government policies designed to support an economy during a period of recession can cause problems for economies later, a theme being played out in a number of countries at the moment. As well as outlining the intellectual foundation for government's responses to events like the global financial crisis, we will, in this course, think carefully about the wider implications of such policies. Let me now begin to outline three key themes in macroeconomics that will form the basis for our course. The first I've called indicators and performance. What do macroeconomists look at to decide the quality of an economy's performance? As you will see in this course, a great deal of macroeconomic analysis is designed to understand the factors that influence a nation's gross domestic product, or GDP. And we will devote our second lecture to understanding what GDP actually measures and why it is such an important concept. For now, it is enough to think of GDP as a measure of goods and services produced in an economy over a particular time period. It's actually a much more subtle concept than that, but we will consider this in more detail in Lecture 2. The chart shown here is gross domestic product for the United States. No matter which country you live in, you'll be able to find similar data that relate to your location. These data are routinely published in countries' national accounts, usually prepared by the official government statistical agency. I want to draw your attention to two features of the GDP data. First is its long-run upward trend. In general, over long periods of time, economies are able to produce more goods and services than was previously the case. And this has been a defining characteristic of most, if not all, economies since the Industrial Revolution. We will look in this course at some of the key ideas macroeconomists have developed to understand why GDP increases in this way over the long run. This is the subject matter of what is called growth economics, an important branch of macroeconomics and an area where some of the most exciting recent developments in the discipline have occurred. The second feature, as apparent from the GDP data, is that there are occasional interruptions to this long-run growth. In the chart, these are shown by the shaded areas, and they represent recessions. Why long-run growth is interrupted in this way is the key question addressed by business cycle analysis. It was this question that Keynes addressed in his general theory, and it is this question that has been front and centre in the minds of macroeconomists ever since the publication of the general theory. We will be spending a lot of our time thinking about exactly this issue. Another important indicator of macroeconomic performance is the rate of inflation, the rate at which the general level of prices in the economy is changing. This chart shows the United States inflation rate since the late 1940s. The historical pattern of inflation in the US is very similar to that of a great many other countries. Highly variable in the 1950s, gradually increasing in the 1960s, remaining stubbornly high in the 1970s, thereafter gradually falling and being for the most part far less volatile. There is one other feature of the inflation data I wish to draw your attention to, because we will return to this in some detail. This is the tendency for the inflation rate to fall during periods of recession. This suggests a theme that we will explore in this course, the interrelationship that exists between GDP and macroeconomic performance more generally and inflation. Another important key indicator of an economy's performance is its rate of unemployment. The chart shows a key characteristic of unemployment that we will explore in this course, namely how unemployment increases rapidly during recessions. With unemployment, we see the human cost of the business cycle. Avoiding recessions, as long as it is done in a responsible way, would be one of the key contributions governments could make to securing the welfare of a great many people. The costs of large-scale unemployment, as we will see, can be huge. I want to spend a little bit of time discussing the role of models in economics. As you will quickly see, macroeconomics, indeed all of economics, relies very heavily on what can often appear to be abstract, highly idealized models. Alfred Marshall, one of the great economists in the discipline's history, famously described economics as dealing with the ordinary business of life. It is this promise that economics offers a systematic way of thinking about everyday life which attracts many to the discipline. Indeed, it may be something like this that attracted many of you to this course. However, students of economics often find it confronting to see how much analysis is conducted using abstract models, representations of the economy and decision-making that appear to relate perhaps only marginally to the ordinary business of life. Without question, this is a potential stumbling block for everyone who encounters economics for the first time. How can a discipline that claims to offer so much by way of understanding the world around us rely on analytical methods that appear so far removed from that very world? The use of models in economics is an important part of the second macroeconomic theme we are going to explore in this course, hypothesizing. Models provide a very powerful way of focusing on the key fundamental forces that are at work in shaping macroeconomic outcomes, and of specifying testable hypotheses about those forces. Without models, a lot of economic discourse would be vacuous, vague statements about what might be going on or what might be important. With models, we have a way of formulating testable hypotheses, which can then be compared to the real-world data to decide the extent to which those models provide us with any real insight. This, I think, is an important advantage of the way economists use models. It is one I would like you to not lose sight of as we proceed through the course. To let you know what you are in for, the next slide shows how we will model the process of long-run economic growth. Don't panic, I will take you through this model slowly and carefully, and you will soon understand all of its intricacies and subtlety. But I want to give you a taste for what you are in for. And the next slide will show one of the ways in which we think about the business cycle. Again, this will look completely foreign to you now. However, we will go through the construction of this model very carefully, and you will find that it is a highly logical and very powerful way of analysing important aspects of the business cycle. What then is the rationale for economists' reliance on abstract models such as these, given that the subject matter of economics is so grounded in the real world, with all of its complexity and innate messiness? The following analogy may be useful. A paper plane is a highly simplified, abstract representation of a real aeroplane. One would never trust one's life to a paper plane. Yet the laws of physics that keep a real plane in the air are exactly the same as the laws of physics that keep a paper plane flying. And one can learn a great deal about those laws by observation and experimentation with a paper plane. Indeed, its simplicity means it is an ideal instrument with which to learn about something which is incredibly complex in reality. It is exactly the same with economic models. No one, I hope, thinks that the abstract, highly simplified and stylized models that economists work with correspond exactly to a real-world economy. That is not what the models are designed to do. Instead, models exist as abstract and very simplified representations of reality, and in doing so enable careful analysis and hypothesizing about the fundamental forces at work in a real-world economy. Without models, economists would have little to say about the economy in any formal sense. It will take you time to get used to economists' use of models. For those new to the discipline, it can all seem a bit strange at first, but rest assured you will soon get the hang of it, and in doing so will come to appreciate the enormous analytical benefits that economists' models provide, benefits that would not be available any other way. The third theme we will explore in this course is the role of public policy in managing the economy. As I mentioned earlier in this lecture, a central tenet of economics is that markets, under ideal conditions, will allocate resources efficiently. Where those conditions don't exist and markets fail to provide optimal outcomes, there may be a role for governments to become actively involved in the economy to secure better outcomes. This is the rationale for government macroeconomic policy. I know of no modern economy that allows its macroeconomic outcomes to be determined purely by market forces. The management of the economy is one of the central responsibilities of government the world over. The picture you are looking at here is of the United States Federal Reserve, the agency responsible for the design and implementation of US monetary policy. And it is monetary policy that is one of the chief policy instruments available to manage the macroeconomy, particularly in the short to medium term. We will be spending a lot of time in this course discussing monetary policy. So let's look briefly at the main types of macroeconomic policy. And here I'm going to confine myself to policies that aim to manage the economy in the short to medium run. An entirely different set of policies exists to promote long-run economic growth. First, as just mentioned, is monetary policy. This is the responsibility of central banks like the United States Federal Reserve, or the Bank of England, or the European Central Bank. Monetary policies can take various forms depending on the economy. Most nations operate their monetary policy by targeting a key interest rate in the economy, in the belief that other interest rates will adjust in line with the rate that is being targeted by the monetary policy, and that this then influences the amount of aggregate spending in the economy. In turn, this exerts a powerful influence on macroeconomic outcomes, primarily GDP and inflation. Monetary policy was an important policy response for most countries to the global financial crisis. Central banks the world over aggressively cut interest rates in the hope that this would encourage spending by firms and consumers. The extent to which this was successful remains a matter of debate. The monetary policy response to the global financial crisis resulted in very low interest rates in a number of countries such as the United States. This in itself has created new challenges for economies because once interest rates have been driven close to zero and even more encouragement is needed to entice spending, what can be done? In the US, the answer has been a different form of monetary policy, quantitative easing, in which liquidity, money, is directly pumped into the economy through the Federal Reserve buying assets from the private sector in return for cash. Whilst the form of policy in the US is unorthodox, the intent of this policy is the same as when central banks target a low interest rate, namely to encourage aggregate spending in the economy to try to stimulate economic activity. We will spend a lot of time looking at monetary policy. It's one of the primary ways in which the macroeconomy is managed. Fiscal policy is the other main arm of macroeconomic management. Fiscal policy involves the government's budgetary variables, government expenditure and taxation, the difference between them, the budget deficit or surplus, and the subsequent implications for the government's level of debt. The extent to which fiscal policy is used as an instrument of short and medium-term macroeconomic management has ebbed and flowed over a number of years. Since around the 1980s, the extent to which governments used fiscal policy to manage their economies was greatly reduced as monetary policy became seen as a more responsive and powerful means of securing favourable macroeconomic outcomes. The global financial crisis changed this, however, as a combination of interest rates being already low, thus limiting the monetary policy response, and the severity of the problem led many governments to aggressively pursue fiscal policy responses to the crisis. Amongst macroeconomists, there is a huge debate now raging about the extent to which fiscal policy was an effective response to the crisis. A lot of the debate is about the size of what is known as the fiscal policy multiplier, the extent to which a change in budgetary variables flows through and affects GDP and employment. There is also debate about how best to manage the massive increase in government's debt that the fiscal policy response has created. We will look at these debates as well as explaining what governments were hoping to achieve from their fiscal policy responses to the crisis. I'm going to conclude this section of the lecture by outlining 6 conventional aims of macroeconomic policy, or more broadly, the circumstances that would have to occur before one would conclude that a nation was experiencing an overall favourable balance of macroeconomic outcomes. The first is rising living standards. In one sense, this is self-evident, but at the same time, defining exactly what we mean by this statement is a matter of some controversy. We often use a nation's gross domestic product as an admittedly crude measure of the standard of living. As we will see in the next lecture, GDP certainly does give an indication of the availability of goods and services to enjoy. But as many people have quite correctly pointed out, access to goods and services is by no means equivalent to happiness or a high standard of living. And when we take into account the many sacrifices that have to be made to secure a growing level of GDP, to take but one example, the possibility of damage to the environment, then the link between the standard of living and GDP may be more tenuous than what at first seems to be the case. We will look at this issue in the next lecture. What we can say at this stage is that along many dimensions, for example, human lifespan, there have been clear improvements in the standard of living over the long run. And this has been associated with growth in GDP. The next slide shows something quite significant about GDP, the extraordinary growth that has been achieved in Western economies since the conclusion of the Second World War. Whether there are limits to this growth, as some argue, or that the costs associated with this growth outweigh the benefits, as others argue, is a matter of furious debate. We won't shy away from this debate in our next lecture, but it really is a topic fully deserving of its own course. The second indicator of good macroeconomic performance is to avoid extreme outcomes. Essentially, this means managing the business cycle, ensuring that GDP grows smoothly without either excessive growth, which may put upward pressure on prices, or significant slowdowns, which are associated with increased unemployment. For a period over the 1990s and 2000s, many economies appeared to have achieved exactly this. Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke christened this period the Great Moderation, by which he meant macroeconomic outcomes in many countries were relatively benign, featuring solid growth and the avoidance of recessions. The global financial crisis put paid to this, with macroeconomic outcomes that were nothing short of disastrous. By this criterion, recent macroeconomic performance in many parts of the world has been, to put it mildly, poor. The maintenance of the real value of the currency refers to avoiding high rates of inflation. The period of the 1960s, 70s and 80s for many countries was characterised by prolonged bouts of high inflation, a period we now know as the Great Inflation. We will discuss why this was the case in a later lecture. This is a topic of more than historical interest, because the changes to the way central banks operated in the wake of the Great Inflation are still very much with us today. Indeed, it is very difficult to understand contemporary monetary policy without understanding the link between monetary policy, central banks, and inflation. And whilst the global financial crisis has muddied the water somewhat, there is still a great deal of truth in the idea that monetary policy today is directed at avoiding a reoccurrence of the Great Inflation of the 1970s and 1980s. The next indicator of macroeconomic performance relates to the sustainability of the debt carried by, respectively, the private and public sectors. Sustainability refers to the ability to generate a flow of income in the future that allows repayment of any past borrowing plus the interest. What matters here is not the absolute size of the debt, though clearly this is important, but first the uses to which the borrowed funds have been put, and secondly, the likelihood that sufficient income will be generated in the future that the debt can be repaid without undue hardship. The massive increase in government expenditure that many countries put into place as an attempt to support economic activity during the global financial crisis has left many economies with unprecedented levels of debt, certainly unprecedented during peacetime. We will look at debt in this course, explain where it comes from, and clarify the issues that surround the concept of debt sustainability. One of the key themes that will emerge from this course is the important role that saving plays in determining a variety of macroeconomic outcomes. Saving represents a particular economic decision, namely to postpone current spending and transfer that purchasing power into the future. This decision, in aggregate, has far-reaching consequences for macroeconomic outcomes, including, in the short run, the business cycle, and in the long run, economic growth. For this reason, macroeconomists pay a lot of attention to what is happening to saving in an economy. The graph shown in this slide, which presents data for Australia, shows one type of saving, that undertaken by households. Specifically, the graph shows the proportion of after-tax or disposable income that is saved. As you can see, household decisions about saving can change through time. And in this course, you will learn how this has important implications for a whole variety of macroeconomic outcomes. Finally, the performance of the economy is often judged by the extent to which those seeking work are able to find employment, the unemployment rate. This is probably the most visible effect of the business cycle, and a variable that shows considerable variation across countries. The chart in this slide shows Spain's unemployment record since 1980. Spain is a country that has had a persistently high rate of unemployment. The rates reached in the wake of the global financial crisis are worrying indeed. Hello and welcome to our second lecture. In this lecture, we're going to focus exclusively on the topic of gross domestic product. I can remember one of my former professors once telling us that macroeconomics is pretty much the study of gross domestic product. I remember thinking at the time, well, that doesn't sound particularly interesting if this discipline is just all about this one thing. But in fact, eventually I realised that he was right. Gross domestic product is such an important part of the macroeconomy, and moreover such an important part of the way macroeconomists think about the economy, that there is hardly a topic in macroeconomics that doesn't in one way or another involve the analysis of gross domestic product. It is absolutely front and centre to our discipline, and understanding this concept, what it is, what it measures, how the role it plays in the economy is going to be important for us in pretty much every single lecture and every single topic. What I want to do in this lecture is talk to you about what gross domestic product actually is, but moreover, I want to demonstrate for you why it's important, and why it's important in the sense that if you have a really good fundamental understanding of what gross domestic product is and what underlies the measurement of gross domestic product, you can actually start saying some pretty important, profound things about some very key macroeconomic issues. For example, have a look at this chart. This chart shows data for the United States on exports and imports. And it shows something that there's a lot of public debate about in the US, and indeed in lots of countries which are also experiencing something very similar to this. You can see from this chart that imports into the United States are invariably higher than exports. And that's true for many countries. There are many other countries for which the opposite is true. Let's just focus on this case. And what you can also see from the chart is that in recent times, the gap between imports and exports has widened considerably. And there's a lot of debate about this and what it actually means and where it's coming from. You'll hear some commentators say, well, this shows how inefficient US industries are. They're no longer capable of sending their products into the global market. Or you might hear that this tells us something about workers in the United States, that workers and work practices in the United States are somehow deficient relative to the rest of the world, and that explains why the gap between imports and exports has widened. And there are lots of other similar explanations or stories that are told. But in fact, there are some profound macroeconomic reasons that go way beyond that sort of superficial argument that can explain this. And indeed, by having a good understanding of gross domestic product, we can see exactly what those important fundamental macroeconomic forces responsible for this gap between imports and exports might be. In other words, if you can understand gross domestic product, you're already a long way down the road towards understanding some very important key fundamental aspects of the macroeconomy. So we'll come back to this chart in a little while after we've explored gross domestic product, and you'll be able to see exactly why it is that there is a gap between imports and exports and what the fundamental reason is for that gap and why it may have widened in recent years. Let's begin with a definition of gross domestic product. This is a fairly standard definition you see here. It measures the flow of economic activity in a geographic region, usually a country, over a particular period of time. Now, we usually think of GDP in terms of a country or a nation, but we don't have to. It is possible to think of measuring economic activity in a state or a province, but at the macroeconomic level, it's usually a country, a nation that we're thinking of. Now, this is a very broad definition of GDP, and in a moment we're going to refine this definition and make it much, much more precise. But I want to draw your attention to this word, flow, because this is a word we're going to encounter at various points during our course. In macroeconomics, we're going to deal with a large number of economic variables, GDP being one of the most important of those. Economic variables can be of two broad different types. The first is a flow, and GDP is indeed one such variable. A flow is a variable that is defined and indeed only makes sense if we think of it existing over a period of time. In your own experience, the income that you earn per week is an example of a flow. We define that variable in terms of a distinct period of time, income earned per week. And quite a few of the economic variables we'll be looking at are flows. That is, they only make sense if we think about them as occurring over a period of time. But there's a second classification of economic variables which is also going to be important for us. These are variables known as stocks. An economic variable that's a stock is defined not over time, but at a particular period of time, or if you like, at a particular point in time. In your own experience, an example of a stock might be the amount of savings deposits you have in a bank account on a particular day, let's say January the 30th. So a stock is not defined over time, it's defined at a point in time. Now, there is a relationship often between flows and stocks. Indeed, at several points in the course we're going to explore that relationship, because it is often the case that the flows we're interested in actually have the effect of building up the stocks. So in this case, it's the flow of income that enables you to increase the amount of saving that you have in your bank account. The flow is contributing to the stock. And we're going to see this interaction between flows and stocks at lots of points during the course. But we will come to that in due course. Right now, I just want to focus on this particular flow, gross domestic product. Now, the other key part of this definition, and this is actually going to be the focus for the rest of the lecture, is that it's a measure of economic activity. Now, this is a tricky concept, because what exactly do we mean by economic activity? How can we actually give that phrase a concrete meaning? And this is not at all a straightforward question to answer, because there are at least three distinct ways of thinking about economic activity. First, we can think about economic activity in terms of production. Here, we'd be looking at the flow of goods and services that are produced in an economy over a particular time period. So how much is being produced over the last 12 months? And that's a very legitimate and way of thinking about economic activity that is obviously going to be very important. But we don't have to think about economic activity as being a flow of production. We can also think about it as a flow of expenditure. How much spending is being undertaken in the economy over a particular time period? And there's a third way of thinking about economic activity. Over a particular time period in an economy, how much income has been earned? So there are three ways of thinking about economic activity. And it's not at all obvious which of those three ways is the most appropriate from the viewpoint of understanding the macroeconomy. It turns out, however, that the distinction between production, expenditure and income as measures of economic activity is not going to be as important as you might think. What I'm going to explain for you is that whilst in some sense these are quite distinct ways of thinking about economic activity, over any particular time period, it turns out that these are going to be equivalent ways of thinking about economic activity. That is, over a year, let's say, if we try to measure economic activity thinking about it as a flow of production, and we then sat down and measured economic activity as a flow of expenditure, and to complete this exercise, we then calculated economic activity thinking about it as a flow of income that's being earned, you will in fact get the exact same answer. In other words, economic activity can equivalently be measured as a flow of production, expenditure and income. and it often doesn't matter which approach you take, you get the same result. Now, it's going to take a little bit of work to demonstrate that, but if you think about it logically, as we go through this, you'll see that this must be true. I want to begin by considering how we might measure economic activity in terms of a flow of production. Now, in a modern industrialised economy, production of a final commodity is often the result of a multi-stage process. To illustrate this, I'm going to take a production process with 2 stages, though in reality there might be many, many more. This will serve to illustrate an important point. So think of the following situation. We'll have 2 firms. Our first firm, the first stage of the production process, is in the business of producing what we'll call an intermediate good. An intermediate good is not something that's purchased by consumers. It's something that's purchased by other firms who use that intermediate good as an input into their production process. So let's go back to our first firm. Firms are in the business of production, and in order to produce, they require what are known as factors of production. And in macroeconomics, we take a very aggregate view of this, and we assume that there are just a small number of these factors of production that are important. Broadly speaking, labour and capital. Now, labour's easy, that's just the workers, that's you and I. Capital is something a little more complex, a little more subtle, and the word capital has a very precise meaning in macroeconomics. When you hear a macroeconomist talk about capital, what he or she is talking about are the physical, tangible assets that firms use in order to produce output. It's the plant and equipment, the buildings, the machines, the production lines, the computers, all of those things that you can touch, physical, tangible assets that in combination with labour yield output. So our first firm is bringing together labour and capital, and in doing so producing this intermediate good. The intermediate good is then purchased by firm 2, our second firm, the final stage of this 2-stage production process. And firm 2 has its own labour and its own capital, which it now combines with that intermediate good to produce the final good, and it is the final good that is purchased by consumers. Now, when you look at it this way, as a multi-stage process, and we think about how we're going to measure the flow of production in the economy, well, in this case, there has been 2 instances where production has taken place. We've had the production of the intermediate good and the production of the final good. So why not simply measure those 2 flows to try to determine what the gross domestic product will be, the economic activity, as a result of this 2-stage process? Well, if we did that, if we measured the intermediate good and then measured the final good, you would actually find that you have a problem known as double counting. And the double counting problem is that if you did it this way, measured the production flows at both stages, you would end up counting the intermediate good twice. And that's because the price at which you would value the final good already reflects the cost of the intermediate good. So if we measured production at both stages of the production process, you would be counting those intermediate goods twice. So when we measure economic activity, thinking about it as a flow of production, we ignore the production of the intermediate good because we're going to pick it up when we value the production in terms of the final good. Let me give you another example. This time we'll have a few more stages. Let's think about the production of a loaf of bread. Now, loaf of bread is something we might purchase every day. Actually, the production of that final loaf of bread is the result of a number of distinct stages of production. First, there's the wheat coming from the farm. Let's suppose that the wheat farmer sells wheat for $1.80. We'll make it easy. There are no intermediate goods here. This is the first stage of the production process. And so we'll talk about value added. Now, value added simply means what has happened to the value of the resources as a result of this production stage. Here, the wheat farmer has taken resources with no value and by selling the wheat on has produced resources with a value of $1.80. The value added at this stage of the production process is that $1.80. There'll be a second stage now where the wheat is sold to a flour mill. The flour mill purchases the wheat for $1.80, so the wheat now becomes an intermediate good for the flour mill. Let's suppose that the transformation of wheat into flour means that that flour can be sold for $3. This stage of the production process has therefore value added to those resources by $1.20. Resources that came into the flour mill valued at $1.80 have now been transformed into resources valued at $3. The next stage is the production of dough. That will require flour, so flour becomes an intermediate good purchased for $3. The dough will be sold, let's say, for $4. So this stage of the production process has added value of $1. And then finally, the bakery takes that dough, turns it into bread. Having purchased the dough for $4, and let's suppose sells the loaf of bread for $4.40, and therefore the value added at that stage, 40 cents. Now, I want to focus on this column, the value added column. This is looking at production at each stage purely in terms of value added. In other words, we are taking out the cost of the intermediate goods at each stage. In doing so, we avoid the double counting problem that we identified in the previous slide. If we add up all of that, all of those value addeds, if we took the total value added by adding the individual value added from each stage, we get $4.40. And in fact, the GDP that has been created as a result of this multi-stage production process will be at $4.40. By adding up the value added for each of these production stages, we have a measure of economic activity that has occurred over this time period, thinking about the economic activity as a flow of production. So one way of thinking about gross domestic product, if we want to think about it as a flow of production, is that it's the sum of value added. What about expenditure? here we have to be very precise about the type of expenditure we're talking about. Broadly speaking, in macroeconomics, there are two different types of spending, two different types of expenditure that we are going to recognise. The first represents expenditure on final goods and services, where those goods and services have been purchased to meet immediate needs. For example, the food that you buy is expenditure to meet an immediate need. Broadly speaking, any expenditure that takes place to meet an immediate need is known as consumption. Now, in the macroeconomy, we are going to identify separate groups or sectors and think about what their consumption expenditure is. The first of these sectors is the household sector. Now, the household sector is you and I. And here, the consumption expenditure is on what are called non-durables. These are things like food that are purchased by households to meet an immediate need. It's going to be important for us to keep track of where that consumption expenditure comes from. Is it expenditure on domestically produced goods and services, or is it expenditure on imports? The government is our second sector. Government is a very large sector in the economy, and so we keep track of any expenditure that it makes to meet its immediate needs. And again, we need to recognise that that can be expenditure on goods and services that are produced within the domestic economy, or it might be the government purchasing those goods and services from suppliers in other countries, imports. And there's a third important sector, the foreign sector, because foreigners are also purchasing. They're also undertaking expenditure, and what they are doing is purchasing a country's exports. So we have three sectors in the economy that engage in consumption expenditure, that are engaging in the purchase of goods and services to meet immediate needs: household, government and foreign sectors. But there is a second type of expenditure known as investment expenditure. Investment expenditure is different. It's where the expenditure is being undertaken not to meet an immediate need, but to meet a need that will exist at some point in the future. Again, we're going to divide this between sectors. For households, investment involves expenditure on what is known as durable goods. An electrical appliance, a stereo system, for example, is a durable. It's something that is purchased now, but it's going to continue to meet needs going into the future. Once again, we need to keep track of whether that expenditure is on goods and services made domestically, or is it indeed an import from another country. Firms become important here. Firms don't undertake any consumption expenditure. Their expenditure is all in the form of investment, because when firms purchase goods and services, it's always going to be with a view to how will this relate to production going forward into the future. Now, firms' investment consists of purchases of plant and equipment, but also inventory of unsold stock, which I'm going to come back to shortly, because it's a bit tricky, I think, to see how this fits in. Basically, what we're saying here is that a firm has produced some stock but not been able to sell it in the current period. It's going to hang on to that stock, and the future need that that meets is that that unsold stock is available to meet demand at some point in the future. So it satisfies our definition of investment, that is, it's something that's going to deliver a benefit or meet a need at some point in the future. And for that reason, we include it as part of firms' investment. Again, you might want to keep track of whether the particularly plant and equipment that is being purchased is being sourced from domestic suppliers or from other countries. The government also engages in investment expenditure. Government buildings, for example, is an example of something where the government is spending money not just to meet an immediate need, but a need going into the future. So we have these different categories of investment expenditure. Consumption, meeting immediate needs; investment, meeting needs in the future. And the other thing I want you to take from this slide is the idea, and we're going to use this over and over again, of dividing the macroeconomy into a small number of distinct sectors. We'll come back to this shortly. Let's go back to our loaf of bread example. Now, we've seen how by looking at value added at each stage of the production process, we obtain a measure of GDP that can be interpreted as valuing the flow of production that takes place over a particular period. Have a look at this number here, though. This is the cost of the final loaf of bread. This represents the expenditure on the final good, not the intermediate good. And as you can see, and fairly logically, that expenditure gives you the exact same answer as the summing together of all of the value addeds. In other words, if we wanted to think about economic activity not in terms of the flow of production, but in terms of the flow of expenditure on final goods and services, that is another way of measuring gross domestic product. And as you can see, what this is telling us is that because of the way we value production using the value-added approach, that what we call the flow of production is exactly the same thing as what we will call the flow of expenditure. Expenditure and production both give us gross domestic product if they are measured appropriately. Now, I'm going to make some assumptions here that we are going to use pretty much throughout the course. Now, you're going to see a lot of assumptions in this course, as indeed you do in any look at macroeconomics. This relates to what I was talking about in our first lecture, the building of models. The fact that we're not trying to create exact replicas of the economy in our analysis, but we wish to work with simplified representations of the economy that enable us to focus on key fundamental forces. So these assumptions are not meant to conform to reality. They don't. What they're meant to do is to simplify our analysis so that we can then focus on the key aspects of the real world that are going to be important for determining macroeconomic outcomes. So our first assumption is this. We're going to assume that it's only firms that engage in investment. Now that's not true. Households buy durables, governments engage in investment. It's just going to make our life much easier in terms of how we model the economy if we restrict investment to firms. It's not going to do any harm to our analysis. If we were to have households and government also doing investment, it's just going to complicate the models we work with without actually adding much in the way of the analysis. So firms are the only sector that engage in investment. And for similar reasons, we're going to assume that households are the only sector that purchase imports. Again, you don't have to make that assumption. We could work with a model of the economy in which government and firms both purchase imports. All that's going to do is make the analysis more complicated without actually adding any significant insight. So we'll restrict imports to the household sector and we'll restrict investment to the firm sector. And pretty much we're going to maintain those assumptions throughout the rest of the course. So we've seen that GDP can be thought of as a measure of the flow of economic activity, and we've seen that we could measure that using either the production approach, adding up all the value addeds, or the expenditure approach, looking at the expenditure on the final goods or services. You end up with the same answer, so GDP is equivalently a measure of expenditure or a measure of production over a time period. But it's also a measure of income. Let me explain. Let's start with firms. Firms are producing the output in the economy and then selling that output. And ultimately, that's the source of income in the economy. Income is derived from the production and the sale of output. Now think about the sales receipts that a firm gets as a result of selling its production. And ask the question, what do firms typically do with those sales receipts? Well, some proportion of those sales receipts gets paid out. It gets paid out in a variety of forms, as wages to its workers, perhaps interest on any loans that have been taken out in the past, rent, maybe the firm is renting its business premises, dividends which flow to shareholders, and any tax that the firm may owe to the government. So the sales receipts that come into a firm, some proportion is going to flow out of the firm as wages, interest, rent, dividends and tax. What happens to the rest? The rest gets classified as either retained earnings, so these are sales receipts that the firm holds on to, but firms also hold on to some funds as an allowance for what is known as depreciation. Now, depreciation refers to the fact that plant and equipment wear out through time and need to be replaced. And often this is fairly predictable, so firms hold back some of their sales receipts as a depreciation allowance, enabling it to replace worn-out plant and equipment as the need arises. Now, retained earnings and this allowance for depreciation are collectively known as business saving. What about the households? We're going to assume that the wages, interest, rent and dividends that firms pay out all flow to the household sector, and in combination they constitute the household income. Now, a proportion of that income can be used for consumption. What's not used for consumption is available for two other purposes. It can be used for household saving, or it can be used to pay taxes. The government sector receives taxes which are paid by firms and households. You can think of that as being the government's income. Out of that income, the government undertakes its expenditure, and there may be a difference between the taxes that the government collects, remember those taxes come from both firms and households, and the amount of expenditure it undertakes, and this we will call government saving. Now, what you're looking at here, T stands for the total value of taxes the government collects, G is this expenditure. This is known as the budget balance. And if taxes over a time period are greater than government expenditure, that's known as a budget surplus. Should it go the other way, where government spending exceeds taxes, that's known as a budget deficit. If the government is running one of these surpluses, it's actually adding to its saving. So the main point I want you to get from this slide is that the ultimate source of income comes from production. It comes from firms selling its production, receiving sales receipts, paying a proportion of those receipts to households, which then becomes household income, paying some of those receipts as tax, which flow to government, which become part of government income, and government income also comes through household tax payments. All right, let's try to summarise what we've learned and indicate a little bit where this is all heading. I'm going to do so using a concept known as national income accounting. It's just keeping track of the flow of economic activity in an economy. I'm also going to introduce you to some notation that we're going to use consistently throughout this course. So, the value of production over a period in an economy is one way of measuring GDP. I'm going to use the letter Y as my shorthand notation for GDP. So whenever you see me write the letter Y like that, I'm talking about GDP. We established previously that the value of production over a period is also going to be equivalent to the value of expenditure over a previous period, over that particular period. Now, that expenditure can take two basic forms. It can be expenditure that occurs domestically, or it can be through exports. In other words, expenditure that is undertaken by people in another country on our GDP. Let me explain what this notation means. Let's start with what is sold domestically. The letter C is going to stand for consumption. Now, households are the only sector in this economy that engage in this sort of consumption. I'm going to put a little d there because this is household consumption on domestically produced goods and services. So when you see me write C, I'm talking about household consumption, and when you see the little letter D, that indicates we're talking about expenditure, about consumption undertaken by households on goods and services that have been produced domestically or in the home economy. G is government expenditure. I'll just do EXP for expenditure. And I is the expenditure undertaken by firms firm investment. So these are the three sources of expenditure from the domestic economy on gross domestic product. The fourth type of expenditure is exports. Now, exports is expenditure not being done by households, government or firms within the domestic economy, but is being undertaken by households, government and firms perhaps in other economies, in other countries. And I'm going to use the letter X as my shorthand notation for exports. So the way to think about what's going on here is that over a period of time, an economy produces some GDP. Over that time period, there will be expenditure on that GDP, and that can either come from households' consumption, government expenditure, or firms' investment, plus the expenditure that comes from other countries, which will show up as exports. Now I want to demonstrate something really important. And this is going to be central to my demonstration of why having a good understanding of what GDP is actually measuring is going to give you already some really important insights into important real-world issues. We have here our expenditure on GDP, as I outlined previously. We know that expenditure equals GDP, which also equals the value of production over that period. We also know that that value of production is equivalent to the income that is generated in the economy over that period. And therefore, GDP can also be viewed as being the sum of business saving, household income, and business tax payments. What we've written on the right-hand side of that little equation is, if you like, all of the ways that the firms distribute their income. They pay some of it to households, they pay some of it to the government, what's left over they keep as their own saving. So that GDP, which remember comes from the proceeds of the sales of production, can be divided up into business saving, household income, and business tax payments. Household income can itself then be divided up. If we think about how households might use that income, they can use some of that income for domestic consumption, they can use some of that income for imports, and I'm going to use the letter M as my shorthand notation for imports. They can save some of it, and they can make the tax payments that are required to the government. Note here, I've got saving with the little b superscript. That's going to be my shorthand for business saving. So all we've done in going from that line to that line is to write business saving as SB and to expand out household income into all of the ways that household income can be used: domestic consumption, imports, household saving, and household tax payments. Let's just tidy this up a little bit and use symbols instead of words. What we have here is that the nation's GDP over a particular time period is going to consist of the savings undertaken by business, household consumption, which can be both domestic produced goods and services and imports, household saving, which I'll now represent by SH, and I'll just write T here for the total taxes that are collected by the government. Remember, they come from both households and firms. And let me tidy that up a bit more and just write S now as the total of business saving and household saving. All I've done in this slide is to summarise everything we've done up to date about GDP, recognising the equivalence between production, expenditure and income, and then introducing you to some notation which will enable us to very conveniently write down what's underlying this calculation of GDP. So I'm now going to bring all of this discussion together and show you how having a profound understanding of the nature of gross domestic product actually enables us to say some really important things about some key aspects of the economy. So these two equations pretty much summarise what it is we've now learned about gross domestic product. The gross domestic product can be thought of as being the value of the flow of production that takes place over a particular time period. We'll call that Y. It can also be thought of as the value of expenditure that takes place in the economy, the flow of expenditure over a particular time period. Equivalently, it can be thought of as the flow of income that has been earned in the economy over that particular time period, and here we are recording the various uses to which that income can be put. As you can see, expenditure and income are going to be the same because these are all ways of valuing a nation's gross domestic product. So let's play around with this, the fact that this expenditure measure and income measure are two equivalent ways of measuring the same thing, gross domestic product. What that means is we can take the amount of domestic consumption in the economy, add to it the amount of government expenditure, add to that firm's investment expenditure, and add to that expenditure from other countries on exports, and over a particular time period, as a matter of logic, that has to be equal to consumption plus imports plus saving plus taxes. Now we can subtract consumption from both sides of that equation, and we're left with something that's going to start looking pretty interesting. Let's write what we have left as follows. Firms' investment is going to be equal to the following. The amount of imports in the economy. Now what I'm going to do is subtract exports from both sides of this equation. So it disappears from the left-hand side and it shows up in the right-hand side as minus x. I'm going to do something similar with government expenditure. I'm going to subtract it from both sides of the equation. And what we have left is also saving. Now I want you to note the following. Let's just focus on that part of the equation, the T minus G. That's the government's budget balance. If that's positive, it's a budget surplus. If it's negative, it's a budget deficit. But let's just keep it in surplus for the purposes of this demonstration. You can think of that as being the government undertaking some saving. Just like you and I, if our income exceeds our expenditure, we are able to save. Well, that's exactly the same for the government. The government's tax income exceeds its expenditure, it's saving. I now want to introduce a very important concept in macroeconomics that we are going to see a lot in this course, the concept of national saving, which I'll abbreviate to NS. As the name suggests, this is the nation's saving. And the nation's saving can be thought of as the saving undertaken by the private sector, that is, the saving that is undertaken by households and firms, business saving, to which we add the saving undertaken by the government. which means if we go back to this expression here, the economy's investment, that is the investment expenditure undertaken by firms, is going to be equal over a period of time to the difference between imports and exports plus that national saving. Or to put it another way, if we take investment and subtract from that national saving, that is going to equal the difference between imports and exports. Now you remember earlier I said I wanted to motivate this discussion of GDP by showing how if you really understand the concept of GDP, that can often be enough to start making some pretty insightful statements about important real-world economic issues. And I said the issue I wanted to consider is why in the United States is there an imbalance between imports and exports? And I said there are certain explanations that one sometimes hears about inefficient US industries and so on and so forth. But what this demonstrates is that the difference between imports and exports must, as a matter of logic, which flows from the very concept of gross domestic product, must represent a difference between the investment expenditure being undertaken in an economy and the amount of saving that's being undertaken in the economy. In other words, if you want to understand why it is that in the United States there are more imports than exports, the right way to answer that question is to try to see why in the United States there is more investment than national saving. That's the question you should be seeking to answer if you're trying to understand this observation that imports exceeds exports. And indeed, we can check, because on this second graph here, I've collected the data for saving and investment for the United States. And it's exactly as you would expect. In this period, where the gap between imports and exports was at its narrowest, that corresponds to the period where the gap between saving and investment was also at its narrowest. And when the gap between imports and exports starts widening, that's going to correspond to the period where the gap between investment and saving starts to widen. And this is one of the real strengths of macroeconomics and of properly understanding concepts like gross domestic product. It enables you to focus on what's really important in the economy. So yes, there is some concern in the United States about the extent to which imports exceed exports. Where do we look to understand why that's happening? We need to look at why there is this imbalance between saving and investment. That's the question we need to answer.